And here again, it confronts TPMT. And as before, TPMT gives another methyl group. So this becomes 6-methyl-TIM, and a part of the drug is shunted away. And finally, this is the active drug, which is the 6-TGN. So if you have high levels of 6-TGN and low levels of 6-MMP, that means your TPMT is not very active, and this is the way the pathway is going. On the other hand, if you have very high levels of 6-MMP as compared to 6-TGN, then you know that there is active shunting going across, and you have to block this shunt. So for therapeutic drug monitoring, if you have access to that, there can be 4 clinical situations. One is there is absent levels of both these metabolites, 6-TGN and 6-MMP, and that's very obvious that the patient is not taking the drugs. What about when you have low levels of 6-TGN and 6-MMP? It means that the diagnosis, that means the dosage of thiopurines is probably homeopathic, 25 milligram or so for 80 kg adults. So obviously it's not working. You have to step it up. What about the fact when you have 6-TGN, which is very low, and high 6-MMP? As I explained earlier, this is a very active shunter. So what you need to do is block the shunt. And how do you do that? Is by giving allopurinol. And the final combination that can occur is a high 6-TGN with the high 6-MMP, and that means this patient is steroid refractory, and obviously you need to change. As I mentioned, the thiopurines are a difficult child, and another problem that they have is their bone marrow toxicity. So which cell line is most vulnerable? The platelets are the least vulnerable, the leukocytes are the most vulnerable, and the red cells are in between. So we monitor these patients every weekly with their blood counts, and if the TLC goes below 4,000, or some people feel below 3,500, then you either need to stop the drug or you need to reduce the drug. And this is just to show you one of our patients at GB Pant. He had extensive petechial rash that you can see. And remember, as I told you, the platelets are the least effective. This patient went on to develop aplastic anemia because of azathioprine. So what are the AGA clinical guidelines for thiopurine monitoring in IBD? So this is from Gastroenterology 2017, where they mentioned that in adult patients with IBD being started on thiopurines, the AGA recommends routine TPMT testing, and they left it that the choice is yours. You can use enzyme activity or genotyping. But if you look, it says what is the strength of the recommendation is conditional, and what is the quality of evidence is low. And in India, although we are Caucasians, especially in the north, our incidence of TPMT mutations is very, very low, even possibly less than 1%. So most people in India do not recommend that we should go ahead with genetic testing for these patients. What is probably more relevance to us is the NUDT15. This is an enzyme associated with 6-TGN, which, if you remember, was the last product. So this is enzyme deficiency. If your NUDT15 is deficient, you're more likely to get TIL, which is thiopurine-induced leukopenia. It's more common. So you can see this China, Japan, Korea, mostly in the Mongoloid races. But we also have 2 studies from India, one from Dr. Desai's group in Mumbai and from Rupa Banerjee's group at the AIG, and both have confirmed that NUDT mutations do occur like in the Mongoloid races in India as well. And if you happen to have an NUDT mutation with a TPMT, then it's a double whammy, and these patients are the most vulnerable for TIL. In fact, maybe they are best avoided in these conditions. So now we're done with the thiopurines, and now I'm going to go on to biologicals, which, as you know, are the standard of care for moderate to severe ulcerative colitis. And here I summarize the Act 1 and Act 2 trials. Now I want you to focus on 2 things. One, what was the primary endpoint? And what was the time limit? So here you can see on the x-axis, it was 8 weeks, a clinical response on the clinical Mayo score. So that means a fall of more than 3 points would be a clinical response. And then concentrate here, steroid-free clinical remission at 52 weeks, which is 1 year. So they were looking at these two parameters, and they showed in both in Act 1 and Act 2 that approximately two-thirds of the patients, 64% or so, the primary endpoint was reached, the patients had a clinical response, and they got it fairly quickly within 8 weeks. And approximately one-third of the patients had a clinical remission, which means a clinical Mayo score less than 2 or less than equal to 2 at 8 weeks. So what it tells us is that Remicade or Infliximab acts quickly. And secondly, that they said that steroid-free clinical remission was achieved in 20%. So 1 in 5 will get a steroid-free clinical remission. And I want you to remember this figure when we compare it with the other drugs, which I'll be talking about subsequently. Now, this slide we've shown, this is from, again, our data from GB Pant, where we've shown that Infliximab acts quickly. So on the left, you can see this was in mid-September, discrete ulcers, deep, scary ulcers that you can see. And 6 weeks later, in November, you can see most of the ulcers have healed. And this is at 6 weeks, sometimes even faster than that. So this is the appearance on 5th December, you can see, and within 18 days, remarkable recovery. So that is a real plus point for Remicade or Infliximab, and that it acts fairly quickly in those who respond to this drug. And there have been at least two studies which focused on steroid-dependent ulcerative colitis. This was one study in Italy, 126 patients. Again, this was focused on patients with steroid-dependent ulcerative colitis. And you can see this is the other study. Sorry, this should have been 102 here. And you can see that a corticosteroid-free clinical remission at 1 year, 47%, and in this study, 40%. So we can say roughly that but between 40 to 50% or so of the patients would have a corticosteroid-free clinical remission with Infliximab. And this is much more than the Act 1 and Act 2, which showed only about 20 or 22%. But what are the issues with Remicade? One, the cost of the therapy. Now, I think till some years ago, this is the data that I made, that the per capita income in India is about 8,000 or so, and the cost of just one vial is 32,000 rupees. And less than 10% of patients in India, they have access to healthcare insurance. So 90% of our patients have to pay through their pocket. So this is frightfully expensive. And the other issue within Remicade is the risk of development of tuberculosis, which is reactivation. And this is our study, multicentric study from 3 centers, only on patients with ulcerative colitis, where we showed that 8% of the patients exposed to this drug developed tuberculosis. Subsequently, another study from AIMS, they had patients with ulcerative colitis and Crohn's disease, and they had the figure of about 10%. What about Adalimumab, which is the other anti-TNF biological that is available in the market? Ultra 1 and Ultra 2 trials showed that the corticosteroid-free clinical remission at 1 year was 13%. So for Remicade, 21% in the Act 1, and the other two studies that I showed you, 40% plus. So Adalimumab is just about 13%. But this French study showed that if you give Adali for 208 weeks, which means for 4 years, then your corticosteroid-free clinical remission goes up to almost 60%. So the question is very often asked, if you have a patient who has steroid-dependent ulcerative colitis, which drug will you choose? You have decided that the patient can afford both. He can afford a biological. So if you had a choice between Infliximab and Ada, which one would you choose? And fortunately, this answer has come very clearly from the AGA technical review, which was published only last month. And they said the scales seem to be tipped in favor of Infliximab. Both drugs have got plus points and negative points. The main plus points of Adalimumab are the ease of administration. It can be given subcutaneously. So just as patients are taught how to take their insulin, you can teach a patient. the adverse events are fewer and the lower cost. For Infliximab, it's certainly more effective, it's faster, but it has more adverse events and it requires an IV infusion. The new drug, biological, that has already hit the Western market but has not yet come to India is Vedolizumab. So I want you to again go back to the coronavirus, and you can, in all the diagrams, it is shown that it has these knobs. So if that coronavirus model you took and take it for a T lymphocyte, and those knobs sticking out, they're going to be like keys, and those keys we're going to call as integrins. And the one that we're interested in is alpha 4 beta 7, and this key is going to fit into the adhesion molecules on the endothelium, and when that happens, the lock opens. So once the lock open, the gates are open, then the T lymphocytes can enter, the monocytes can enter the active area for inflammation and add on and worsen the ulcerative colitis. But what if I took a tape and taped this key? Then obviously this will not go in. So this is exactly what Vedolizumab does. It is a humanized molecule, and it binds very effectively to these alpha 4 beta 7, and this has shown promising results. However, I must say that these studies are only not yet designed for steroid dependent. And in this slide, I've shown what I was just talking about in the previous slide. So this is the artist's kind of conception. This is the lymphocyte that you can see. The lymphocyte has got these integrins, and this is the MADCAM on the endothelial aspect. So this binds, and what it also tells you is that the T lymphocytes and monocytes, they are very adept at yoga because they can twist their body and then go through this. And Vedolizumab in the West was the first anti-integrin antibody approved for IBD. Two sets of trials took place, the Gemini 1 and the Gemini 2. The Gemini 1 was for ulcerative colitis, the Gemini 2 was for Crohn's disease. And in the Gemini 1, it was 18 to 80 years, and they took non-responders to corticosteroids, which is corticosteroids, immunosuppressants, anti-TNF. However, no details were provided whether it was steroid refractory, steroid dependent, type 1, type 2. But what was mentioned in the text was that 17% of them were non-responders to corticosteroids and thiopurines. And overall corticosteroid-free remission rate at 4 weeks was 45%, and 8 weeks is 31%. So we started with the Act 1 and Act 2. Their corticosteroid-free remission rate was 20% at 1 year. So here we have a drug which at 8 weeks is giving you a value of 31%. But again, as I said, this is not specifically designed for patients with SDUC. And the best part was that the adverse events were minimal. So after the biologicals, let's discuss about cyclosporine. Cyclosporine, most of you are familiar with. There have been several studies on this, and they have been compared with Infliximab in particular. And this study that appeared in Lancet almost 8 years ago, they looked at things from a different perspective. They said, what is the failure rate of both the drugs, and what are the adverse events? So the green column is the cyclosporine, the red column is the Infliximab. So you can see the failure rate in cyclosporine was 60% versus 54%, which was not statistically significant. However, in the West, since this was a multicentric study, mainly in the West, the adverse events in cyclosporine were much higher as compared to the Infliximab groups. So although the author says both the drugs are equally efficacious, what was written between the lines, if you read them, it said that Remicade or Infliximab may be preferable because the adverse events are low. However, if this cannot be applied to Indian data because they would probably add another 10% due to tuberculosis. So what we can say is that Infliximab and cyclosporine are absolutely equally efficacious. There's a higher risk of TB, and this has more adverse events, but tuberculosis, which is a major problem in South Asia, is much more than. So if I have to summarize this, I would say cyclosporine is the poor man's Infliximab. Now I'm going to be a drug which may not be well awareness, maybe not much. Tacrolimus. This is a macrolide anti. Is about we use it, and we use much higher levels. It's extensive in transplant and liver transplant. It was first used in Japan for steroid dependent and steroid refractory ulcerative colitis, promising results, and a few studies from the West as well. So this is the international experience. And if you look at this table, which is rather crowded, you can see that it's flush with Japanese names, not surprising, because that's the country where there's maximum trials on this drug. The first drug trial was RCT conducted by Ogata. Number of sample size or number of patients was small, just 19. And the same author then conducted an RCT in 2012, 32 patients. And what he showed was a clinical response in 50% of the patients just at 2 weeks. Subsequently, from the West, Schmidt 2013, large number, 130 patients, treatment duration 12 weeks, and they showed a clinical remission. Here we were talking about clinical response. Here we're saying 70% of the patients will have a clinical remission within 12 weeks. And then 2 subsequent studies from Miyoshi and Kawakami. Both were retrospective. This was retrospective, this was prospective. Sample size of about 50. This was for almost 6 months. And Kawakami for just 4 weeks. And they showed that the clinical response 63, 90%. Even if you think that this is an outlier, we can say that the clinical response would be in about 50% of the patients. And anywhere between 10 to 75%. At GB Pant, this is our experience. We had 52 patients, 30 in the steroid dependent and 20 in the steroid refractory. And overall clinical response, since we gave it for 8 weeks, was 56%. And clinical remission overall, 48%, 36% in steroid dependent, and almost 2/3 in the steroid refractory, and combined clinical and endoscopic remission in 1/3 of the patients. So this drug does seem to have a role because the main advantages are that it is oral, it has very little side effects, and it's cheap. So this was the first talk that theory that we have and rhythms. Now talk three. So let's steroid dependent type 1. So which means that you started the steroids and then it was tapering down and then you have relapse. So we have a 32-year-old female. This was her first episode of ulcerative colitis. It was severe. She had E3 disease. The clinic had excellent response to because she responded. The tapering going back. The moment she reached 20 milligram, and on the 5th day, the stool frequency goes up to 5 to 6 with blood streaking. Therefore, this is type 1. And on the 5th day, the stool frequency goes up to 5 to 6 with blood streaking. Therefore, this is type 1 steroiditis. So now the options. If I'm using ads, and the options are option A, revert to 40 milligram. So option A is that you go back to 40 milligram. Option B is you step up the steroid a little bit so it becomes 30 milligram and you add azathioprine or thiopurines at this dosage. Option C, you continue the same dose, which is prednisone 20 milligram, and you add the biological Remicade I would suggest would be a better choice than Adalimumab. And choice D, IV hydrocortisone 300 milligram per day. So since I don't have access to this, let's see the answers. Now, what about the first? Somebody that revert back to prednisone, that would be a very great choice, because if you go back to 40, and when you come down to 20 on subsequent, again the patient is likely to show the same thing. So let's not go into this choice. So the two right answers, as I said, medicine is more of an art than a science. You can have more than one right option. You can continue prednisolone 30 milligram, and this is the one up. So you go with the patient was doing it, and the patient had to relax. So prednisolone 30 milligram with azathioprine. Here we will again start tapering slowly, but you would have to use a slightly higher dose, or dose on which the patient did not have a relapse. Option C is like Act 1 and Act 2, that if you have a patient who's not doing well and with steroid, you can use Remicade, and this is also right choice. If the patient has no problem, financial problem, then this might be you really don't need to give IV hydrocortisone, because IV hydrocortisone would have to be converted to prednisolone 40, and then you would come down, so you're actually wasting time. So this is not. So let's take case 2. Now case 2 is refractory 52-year-old female, known case of ulcerative colitis for 15 years, E3 disease. In September, she had a relapse, 5/9, treated elsewhere, short course of oral steroids, something like a pinch hitter for 3 weeks, so 4 weeks. And since the has severe relapse in November 2019, which required IV steroids, and subsequently switched on to oral prednisone 40 milligram per day plus low. Now she has a relapse again in March 20. She comes to us. She started on oral corticosteroid, failed. She didn't do well. We switched to IV hydrocortisone. In fact, this patient is still with us in the hospital. On day 5, hydrocortisone, she has a clinical Mayo score of 8/9, CRP more than 25, stools more than 10. So going by the Oxford criteria, she should be sent for surgery. So let me see what options do we have for here. Again, I wish I could say, please open your voting pads. So the options here are: continue IV hydrocortisone for another 5 days, hoping she's a slow responder. B, switch to Remicade 5 milligram. C, switch to cyclosporine 2 milligram per kilogram. And D, call the surgeon, because this patient is going to end up with a total proctocolectomy. So I don't know what which option you have chosen, but I just wanted to remind you what was missed in this is the step 2. So if you do the step 2 in this is what we found: deep craters, and these were biopsied. And what did we find? Colonic biopsy showing classical mononuclear, these cells, binuclear cells, so suggestive of CMV. So this patient is not corticosteroid refractory. She's CMV colitis, and her diagnosis would be IBD, ulcerative colitis, E3 disease, frequent relapses requiring corticosteroids, and currently she has CMV colitis. So the choice of treatment in her is going to be IV ganciclovir. You would give it for at least 2 to 3 weeks before switching on to valganciclovir, which is oral. We would try and taper steroids a little faster, but we would continue azathioprine because that doesn't increase the risk of CMV. The third case that we have today is steroid-dependent ulcerative colitis. This is a type 2. So let's go through the details. She's a 32-year-old female, first episode of ulcerative colitis, E3 disease, and her clinical Mayo score is 6/9. She had excellent response to prednisone 40 milligram per day. At 8 weeks, her clinical Mayo score was 109. Steroids were discontinued. On day 70, the stool frequency became 3 to 4. She called up her physician. Misaliform edema was added. And 10 days later, all hell broke loose. She's passing 8 to 10 stools per day, blood in all stools. PR is 100. Her pulse rate is 100 per minute. She's afebrile, C. diff negative, CMV negative. So, what would you do? Again, pick up your voting pads. Now, the options are revert to prednisolone 40 milligram, option prednisolone 20 milligram as a therapy, option C, prednisolone 40 milligram plus azathioprine, option D, cyclosporine. The right answer is possibly prednisolone with azathioprine. If you just go, I want to just go with prednisolone, then you will left, you would have to have a thiopurine in the form of either 6-MP or azathioprine. Prednisone 20 is clearly not the right option because the dose of prednisone is much too much low. Here, prednisone again, you want to combine with cyclosporine. I wouldn't do that. I would think that she deserves prednisolone and azathioprine. So this patient can be followed up. This is wait for 7 to 10 days and see if she is not respondent. I would survive hydrocodone and take a call. And if she's still not responding, then we will, she's not responder and give her biologicals. As of now, we drug 5-say with all their steroids, immunomodulators, and biologics. To have the next 2 years, JAK inhibitors, tofacitinib, already in the US, IL-2, IL-12, and 23 is Adalimumab, S1 agonist, Vedolizumab, and the newer biologic is Vedolizumab. No that can lead on steroid dependent and ulcerative colitis and steroid refractory without surgery. So one must always realize that not all cases of ulcerative colitis respond to medical therapy. And the ultimate aim is to save the patient. We're not interested in just saving the colon. And surgery definitely improves the quality of life. It may be life-saving. If you have a patient with steroid refractory disease, usually there is a 3-stage proctocolectomy. Steroid dependent, some cases you can get away with a 2-stage, otherwise it is still a 3-stage. And the good thing is that the need for surgical intervention is steadily falling. So here, at 1 year, it is about 2%, and 5 years, it is 8%. Now, again, go back to one of my initial slides from the Mayo Clinic, which said that 1 year, surgical colectomy rate was 29%. We are talking about something which is 2%. So clearly, we have moved a lot in the last 30 years or so. So my take-home message of this talk is that medical therapy remains the backbone of treatment for patients with steroid dependent as well as for steroid refractory ulcerative colitis. We have two main classes of drugs, which are immunomodulators and biologicals. Data on Tacrolimus is still emerging. The newer drugs are constantly being added to the armamentarium, which is good news. In the last 5 decades, there's been a steady decline in the need for surgical intervention, but the role of surgery is selective and definitive. And the goal of the physician should be to recognize medically refractory disease and refer to the surgeon at the appropriate time. And finally, this is my last slide. The take-home message is that steroid-dependent ulcerative colitis, if we say, is about 20% as of now, then with the new drugs, this sector should be gradually becoming lesser and lesser. But I can assure you this can never disappear, and there will always be a role for surgery. What we can do is, with all the new drugs, make it as small as possible so the least number of patients are referred for surgery and lose their colon. Thank you for your very patient hearing. I understand it's Saturday evening, and here you have to spend 1 hour or so listening to a talk on steroid-dependent ulcerative I understand it's Saturday evening, and here you have to spend 1 hour or so listening to a talk on steroid dependent ulcerative. Weeks. The next question is from Mumbai, Dr. Kinare. He's asked, is more right? Or I think the data, if you can read the article which I quoted from Alternate Country, they are almost comparable, and that is the data that we have. Next question is also again from Mumbai. What is more common, steroid dependent or steroid refractory? From Pant, I can give you the data. It is roughly the ratio of SDUC and SRUC is 3:1 or 4:1. So SDUC is more common than SRUC. The next question is from Dr. Praveen Kumar, Trivandrum. If Infliximab is not effective, then what biologicals to prefer? Well, then you have to switch, and if it is not working against anti-TNF, then if you do have an option, I think the obvious choice would be Vedo, which is anti-integrin, and even that drug is not available in India. But if you had the choice and you were working elsewhere, then maybe even anti-IL-12 or 12/23 would be the next choice. Then I have a question from Patna, which is for how long biologicals to be given if there is response? Again, that's a very relevant and germane question. And the short answer is about 2 years. So at the end of 2 years, and you always combine Remicade with thiopurines, you combine them and you give them for 2 years. And in the West, they are very scared of thiopurines. So mostly these patients in the West, their thiopurines are taken off and the patients are left on Remicade. But in India, I don't think we can do that. It is expensive and the risk of tuberculosis. So at the end of 2 years, I would probably take off Remicade and continue with the thiopurines. But as we know from the trials, if the patient, once you stop the biologicals and if they have a relapse, then you can go back and restart the biological. And 50% of the patients, you will again be successful. Then we have a question from Dr. Ajay Kumar, AIMS Rishikesh. Any role of serum torch prior to biological use? I think the checklist of this is essentially that you have to exclude tuberculosis. So all our workup is that you need to exclude these patients. But yes, torch, you have to exclude cytomegalovirus definitely. So out of that, I would just choose C. diff, CMV, and tuberculosis. The next question is from Dr. Ram Kumar from Chennai. He wants to know that thiopurine inhibitors white blood cell. Once white blood cell gets suppressed, means patient attempt to develop leukopenia. I'm not sure I follow this question. What he probably means is how do you monitor develop leukopenia? So if your dose of 2 milligrams per kilogram, and you'll see something between 1,000 and 4,000, then half. If you're just using 1.5 and the patient is developing 3.5, then it'd be the most prudent thing would be to stop and access to PMT and NG, then you can go for testing. And lastly, if a patient is taking steroids for 3 months, then the SRUC and find several CMV, including body biopsy, what should be done? I think that's the case that we want. Then and the patient is not